What would you do if your own son, the child you sacrificed everything for, stood at the dinner table and called you a loser, choosing your ex-wife's new husband over you? This is the story of how one father, betrayed in his own home, decided to take back everything he had given, and the shocking fallout that left his son without a car, without a house, and without a clue who he could really trust. The night it happened began like any other, with the smell of roast beef and mashed potatoes filling the kitchen of my modest home in Davenport, Iowa. The windows cracked open just enough for the spring breeze to carry in the faint fragrance of lilacs blooming by the back fence, and everything felt ordinary, steady, peaceful, until James shattered it all with a sentence that still echoes in my chest like broken glass. He had been restless all evening, stabbing his fork into the meat as if it had done him wrong. His 30-year-old face twisted with the bitterness of someone who thought life had cheated him, and when his voice finally broke the silence, it was sharp, cruel, and deliberately loud. "You're a loser, Dad. But Mom's new husband, Dylan, he's not. He's a real man. He's got cars, money, power. I think I'll call him Father from now on." The words hung there, thick and poisonous, as if the air itself had turned heavy. My daughter Adeline gasped beside me, her hand flying to her lips, her 28-year-old eyes filling with tears as she tried to defend me. "James, stop it," she said, her voice quivering but firm. "Dad's been the one who raised us, who gave us everything, who worked himself to the bone for us. Don't talk to him like that." But James only leaned back, scoffing, his laugh a hollow bark that didn't sound like my boy anymore. "Come on, sis," he sneered, pushing his plate away with a clatter. "Look at him, 62 years old, still working construction jobs, still scraping by while Dylan runs real businesses, makes real money, drives real cars. Dad's just average. Dylan's the kind of man I want to follow." His chair screeched across the hardwood as he stood abruptly, his jacket swinging over his shoulder, his footsteps heavy with contempt as he stormed out the door without even glancing back. Adeline sat frozen, her hand clutching mine in wordless comfort, but I felt the tremor of her own hurt in that grip. She kissed my cheek before following him out into the night, her voice trailing. "I'll talk to him, Dad. Don't let this break you. You're the best father anyone could ask for." But when the door clicked shut and the quiet descended again, I sat staring at the plates, half filled with food gone cold, the roast congealing in its juices, the condensation dripping from my untouched glass of water, and I thought of the photograph on the wall, the four of us smiling in the backyard a decade ago, before the divorce, before Dylan's expensive suits and his hollow promises poisoned everything. I didn't clear the table. I couldn't. Instead, I stepped outside, the cool air brushing against my face, the stars above scattered like diamonds against a velvet sky, and I cracked open a beer, the hiss of the cap breaking the silence, the bitterness of the drink grounding me as the sting of James's words replayed in my mind again and again. That night, sitting in the old patio chair I had built with my own hands, staring at the stars, memories surged through me uninvited. The day I bought James his first car, a Honda Civic fresh off the lot, reliable and safe, a gift I had proudly handed to him when he was 20 and lost after college, only to hear him mutter, "Thanks, I guess, but Dylan drives a Mercedes." That wound, long buried, reopened with searing clarity. I remembered the house too, the two-bedroom I had purchased in his name when he was 25 and drowning in debts, telling him, "This is your chance to build a future, son." While I quietly made every single mortgage payment, because he never could. I thought of the endless bills, the rent checks, the late-night calls when he needed money for some new scheme that always fizzled before it began, and through it all, Dylan lingered in the background, throwing around money, making grand speeches, convincing James that real power came not from work but from flash. That night under the stars, something inside me hardened. I had always chosen patience, always chosen forgiveness, always chosen to keep giving, but enough was enough. If James wanted to call me a loser, he would finally learn what life without me looked like. At dawn, I rose with a clarity that felt like steel running through my veins. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't even make coffee. I simply grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, slid into my old pickup, and drove straight to James's house. The neighborhood was quiet, the lawns damp with morning dew, the sound of birds greeting the day in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. His Honda Civic gleamed in the driveway, freshly washed with the money I had given him just weeks ago for detailing. When he opened the door, his hair tousled, his pajamas wrinkled, his face bleary from whatever late-night indulgence he had chased, I looked him square in the eyes and said, "Give me the car keys, James." He blinked, confused, then laughed, a disbelieving chuckle that grated on my nerves. "What? No, that's my car. You gave it to me years ago." I pulled the registration from my pocket, the paper crisp between my fingers, and held it out. "No, son, it's mine. Registered in my name, insured in my name, repaired with my money. Every bill, every payment, every ounce of responsibility has been mine. Now give me the keys." He faltered, his eyes flicking from the paper to the car, his confidence faltering. "This is low, Dad. Even for you," he muttered, but he disappeared into the house and returned with the keys dangling from his fingers. He slapped them into my palm, his voice trembling with anger. "Fine, take it. But Dylan was right about you. You're just bitter. You'll never be more than a small man." I didn't answer. I slid into the Civic, started the engine, and drove away, his figure shrinking in the rearview mirror, his bitterness still burning in my ears. My next stop was the bank. The glass doors slid open as I entered, the cool air of the lobby contrasting with the fire in my chest. I approached the counter, placed the mortgage papers on the desk, and said calmly, "I need to cancel the automatic payments on this property." The teller clicked through her computer, raised her eyebrows slightly, and confirmed it could be done. With a pen, I signed the forms, each stroke of ink like cutting a tie that had bound me too long. As I walked out, my phone buzzed in my pocket. James's name flashed on the screen, his voice exploding the moment I answered. "Dad, what the hell did you just do? The bank called. You're cutting me off? You're throwing me out? You're ruining my life over one comment." I paused in the sunlit parking lot, gripping the phone tighter, and answered steadily. "One comment? No, James. This is about years of disrespect, years of me giving while you took, years of you praising Dylan while spitting on my sacrifices. This is the line. I'm done funding your life." He screamed, cursed, begged, but I hung up, the silence afterward louder than his rage. Driving home, the Mississippi River gleamed to my left, the water flowing steady, unbothered, eternal, and I felt something settle in me. Resolve, clarity, maybe even freedom. But the storm had only begun. That evening, Adeline called, her voice soft but urgent. "Dad, James is furious. He's with Dylan right now. Dylan says he'll take care of things, that you'll regret this. Please be careful." I thanked her, reassured her, but my heart sank because I knew Dylan wouldn't stop here. And sure enough, not long after, my phone rang again. This time it was Anne, my ex-wife, her voice shrill with panic and accusation. "Roy, what are you doing? James is hysterical. You took his car, you stopped the house payments. He's your son. You can't just abandon him like this." I let her words wash over me, steadying myself before replying. "Hello to you too, Anne. I haven't abandoned him. I've simply stopped carrying him. He's 30 years old. He needs to learn responsibility." She scoffed, her words sharp. "Responsibility? He's not ready. Dylan says you're being cruel, and if you don't fix this, we'll take legal action. You'll lose everything in court." Dylan again. Always Dylan. I walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, the children playing on their bikes, their laughter innocent and free. "Let him try," I said calmly. "The car, the house, the payments, they're all in my name. Everything James had came from me, not Dylan, not you. If Dylan wants to fight, let him fight. I'm ready." There was silence on the line, a sharp exhale, then she hung up without another word. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the fading light outside, the weight of decades of sacrifice pressing down on me, but beneath it all, a fire burned. For years, I had carried my son while Dylan played the hero. But that era was over. This was the beginning of something new. The beginning of James learning the meaning of consequences, and the beginning of me reclaiming the respect that had been stripped away piece by piece. The days after I cut James off unfolded like the gathering of a thunderstorm, each moment darker, heavier, and charged with the promise of lightning. And though the silence of my house should have brought me peace, it was broken instead by the relentless buzz of my phone. James calling, texting, raging, then begging, his words a whirlwind of anger and desperation. And always in the background, I could hear the echo of Dylan's influence, slick and poisonous, pulling strings like a puppeteer who thought he owned my family. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple with rain clouds rolling over Davenport, I sat in my old armchair, sipping coffee, the bitterness grounding me, when Adeline's name lit up the screen, her voice hushed but trembling as she said, "Dad, James is spiraling. He told me Dylan's promised to pay the mortgage and give him money, but only if he cuts ties with you completely. Dylan's laughing about it like he's finally gotten rid of you. Please be careful, Dad. He's not just helping James, he's using him against you." Her words sank into me like cold steel, but instead of fear, they ignited something I hadn't felt in years, resolve, not just to defend myself, but to expose Dylan for the fraud he was. Later that night, my ex-wife Anne called, her tone frantic, almost shrill, scolding me for what she called cruelty. "Roy, James is your son. He's talking about being homeless, and Dylan says you're deliberately ruining his life out of jealousy. Do you hear yourself? You sound vindictive. Dylan's willing to step in and fix this if you'll just stop interfering." I stood by the window as she spat her accusations, watching the streetlights flicker on, the neighborhood bathed in a soft glow that mocked the chaos of my life, and I answered with quiet steel. "Jealousy, Anne? No, this isn't jealousy, this is justice. For years, I've built while Dylan played. I poured concrete, hammered nails, skipped vacations, and worked overtime so James and Adeline could have stability, while Dylan bought flashy suits and whispered promises. I've carried James long enough. If Dylan wants to pay, let him, but he won't control me anymore." She huffed, threatened lawyers, then hung up, leaving the line dead but my determination alive. It was then I realized this battle wasn't just about James anymore. It was about my dignity, my years of sacrifice erased by Dylan's smirk, and my son's blindness. The next morning, I drove to the office of Tom, an old acquaintance and lawyer I had worked with years ago during a construction dispute. The brick building stood firm on the edge of town, its red facade weathered but reliable, and stepping inside felt like stepping into strategy itself. Tom greeted me with a firm handshake, his eyes sharp behind his glasses as I spread the documents across his cluttered desk. The car registration, the mortgage deeds, the years of bank statements proving every cent had come from me. "I've cut James off," I told him, my voice steady, and Dylan's circling. "They're threatening lawsuits, but I want to know where I stand. I want to make sure I'm protected, and if Dylan pushes, I want to be ready to push back harder." Tom studied the papers, tapping his pen thoughtfully before nodding. "You're on solid ground, Roy. The car, the house, every asset, they're all in your name. If James or Dylan tries to sue, they'll fail. But," he added, leaning forward, "Dylan's got business interests. I've heard whispers of tax issues. If he escalates, we can expose him. You've got leverage you don't even realize." His words landed like sparks on dry wood, igniting a fire of strategy in me. I left his office with a folder of draft documents, cease and desist letters, asset transfer forms, and a mind sharper than it had been in years. I didn't stop there. From Tom's office, I drove across town to see Ellen, my accountant, her office sterile and humming with fluorescent lights, her desk piled with spreadsheets. She adjusted her glasses, scanned my records, and confirmed what I already knew. No joint accounts, no shared liabilities with James. "Your finances are clean," she said, then added, "but Dylan's firm, I've seen filings, there are irregularities. If someone were to tip off the IRS, he'd be audited in weeks." I nodded slowly, the idea planting itself firmly. For years I had stayed silent, enduring Dylan's arrogance, but now I had tools, leverage, and truth. That evening, back in my quiet home, I sat at my desk under the warm glow of the lamp, the papers from Tom and Ellen spread before me like a battlefield map. I typed into the IRS's anonymous tip line, entering the dates, the figures, the questionable deductions Ellen had flagged, my fingers steady on the keyboard, my pulse calm and deliberate. When I hit submit, a strange calmness washed over me, as though I had finally stepped onto equal footing with the man who had haunted my life for years. Moments later, I sealed envelopes, certified letters addressed to James and Dylan, notices that payments had ceased, that assets were frozen, that the era of endless handouts was over. I pressed each stamp with finality, imagining the look on their faces when the mail arrived. But just as I leaned back, satisfied, my phone vibrated violently on the desk. Dylan's name flashing on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered, putting it on speaker, and his voice, usually smooth and smug, was cracked with fury. "Roy, you old fool, what the hell do you think you're doing? Freezing accounts? Meddling in my business? You're poking the wrong bear. I've got lawyers who'll bury you in paperwork. You're bitter, jealous, pathetic, and you're destroying James in the process." His words echoed in my living room, bouncing off the walls like venom, but I stood at the window watching the street below and replied with quiet strength. "Destroying James? No, I'm teaching him what you never did, responsibility. You've been poisoning him for years with your promises and your money. I'm done being erased. Threaten all you want, Dylan, but my lawyer's ready, my finances are clean, and your empire isn't as untouchable as you think." He barked a harsh laugh, full of arrogance, then slammed the line dead, but the silence he left behind was telling. It wasn't confidence, it was fear dressed as bluster. That fear revealed itself quickly. The next morning, as the rain fell steady against the windows, I drove past James's house and saw the first signs of collapse. Movers were parked in the driveway, hauling out boxes, James standing on the porch with slumped shoulders, his anger replaced by confusion and despair. My phone buzzed again as I drove on, his voice cracked with desperation. "Dad, please, the eviction notice came. I'm packing everything. Dylan says I can stay with him for now, but it's not permanent. Don't do this. Just this once. Help me out. I'll change, I promise." For a moment, as I listened to his voice, raw and trembling, I remembered him as a boy, clutching my hand after a thunderstorm had knocked out the power, looking at me like I was the only person who could fix the world. And the memory tugged at me. But then I remembered every bailout, every ungrateful word, every time he compared me to Dylan, and I knew this plea was not transformation. It was desperation. My reply was firm, steady, and final. "This once, James, it's been a lifetime of just this once. I've carried you for years, now you carry yourself. When you're ready to stand like a man, call me. Until then, learn." I hung up, his sobs echoing in my ears, but my heart, though heavy, was resolute. Later that day, Adeline came by, her eyes red with worry, but her presence a comfort. She hugged me tightly, whispered, "I'm proud of you, Dad. He needs this. Dylan's influence has poisoned him for too long." And for the first time in years, I felt seen, understood, not just as a father, but as a man who had given everything and finally decided to stop being invisible. Yet Dylan wasn't done. That evening, an email arrived in my inbox, subject line blazing in capital letters, "Cease your interference immediately." His words were a storm of threats, lawsuits, restraining orders, financial ruin. But I read them with the calm of someone who finally understood that bullies roar loudest when they're weakest. And as the rain cleared and the stars returned, I stepped outside into the cool night, the grass damp beneath my boots, and looked up at the vast, silent sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small under those stars. I felt steady. I felt like the storm was breaking in my favor. Part of me knew the war with Dylan wasn't over, but another part knew that the tides were shifting, that James was finally beginning to see the truth behind Dylan's mask, and that soon, very soon, the man who had stolen my family's loyalty would stand exposed, his empire crumbling, his influence stripped away. And in that moment, I vowed that I would see it through, no matter what it took, because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my legacy, and the respect that should never have been lost in the first place. The final chapter of this storm did not explode all at once. It unraveled slowly, piece by piece, like a frayed rope finally snapping under the weight of years of lies. And as I watched Dylan's empire crumble under the pressure of audits, investigations, and the whispers of former allies abandoning him, I felt a strange stillness settle in me. Not triumph, not gloating, but the quiet relief of a man who had been vindicated after years of being dismissed, mocked, and erased. And though Dylan raged and fumed, sending message after message filled with threats of lawsuits and promises of destruction, the truth was stronger than his words, and the walls he had built on deceit began to collapse with every passing day. Rumors swirled across Davenport, clients pulling out, tax liens surfacing, creditors circling like vultures, and for the first time since he entered our lives, Dylan looked less like a king and more like a con man scrambling to keep his throne, his arrogance cracking like cheap porcelain under fire. Meanwhile, James wandered between the ruins of Dylan's promises and the harsh reality of his own choices, calling me less with rage now and more with quiet, broken words that revealed the truth he had resisted for so long, his voice softer every time he reached out. Dad, Dylan's not who I thought he was. He says he'll help me, but every favor comes with chains. His house is cold, his eyes are cold, everything about him feels empty. I can't believe I threw away what I had with you for this. And each time he confessed, I listened in silence, my heart heavy but resolute, until finally one evening his voice cracked completely, and he whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad, for everything. For calling you a loser, for choosing Dylan over you, for spitting on everything you gave me. I see it now. I see who really stood by me." His apology was like the first green sprout after a storm, fragile, uncertain, but alive, and though my scars ran deep, I told him what needed to be said. "Words are only the beginning, James. If you want my respect back, you must build it with actions, brick by brick, like I built every foundation you've ever stood on." Days later, proof of his sincerity arrived not in grand gestures, but in sweat and labor. He found work, real work, backbreaking and humbling, the kind of job that left his palms blistered and his muscles sore, and when he told me about it, there was no entitlement in his voice, no demand for money, just a man beginning at last to stand. Adeline remained steady as ever, her love and loyalty anchoring us both, and together we began to stitch the torn fabric of our family, thread by thread, not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. Dylan, meanwhile, grew more desperate as the ground shifted under his feet, and one hot summer night, when the cicadas droned outside and the air pressed heavy like wet wool, he arrived at my doorstep in a sleek car that seemed more borrowed than owned, his once tailored suit wrinkled, his face lined with fear and fury. He pounded on my door with fists that shook the wood, and when I opened it, he stood there with wild eyes, his voice breaking as he spat. "Roy, you think you've won, don't you? You think cutting off James, meddling in my business, makes you some kind of hero? You're a bitter old man, jealous of everything I've built. I gave your family a future, and you gave them scraps." I let him rant, his words spilling like a drowning man's thrashing, and when he finally stopped, chest heaving, I answered with a quiet strength that cut deeper than shouting ever could. "No, Dylan, you didn't give them a future. You gave them illusions, smoke and mirrors that vanish under pressure. I gave them a foundation. I gave them sacrifice. You gave them nothing but false promises, and now the truth has caught you." At that moment, James stepped out from the shadows of the yard where he had been standing, his face pale but his eyes steady, and he looked at Dylan, not with awe, not with admiration, but with the clarity of a man finally awake. "Stop, Dylan," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I won't be your pawn anymore. You used me, twisted me against my father, made me believe you cared, but all you ever wanted was to hurt him. I see it now, and I'm done." Dylan spun, stunned, his words stumbling as though someone had yanked the script from his hands, but James did not flinch, and in that moment, I saw not the boy who had betrayed me, but the man he was trying to become, standing firm for the first time without a handout, without illusions, without leaning on anyone but himself. Dylan's face twisted, his arrogance collapsing into desperation, and with a curse, he stormed back to his car, slammed the door, and roared off into the night, his headlights shrinking into nothingness, his empire crumbling behind him like sandcastles in the tide. The weeks that followed felt different, lighter, as though the air itself no longer carried the weight of his shadow, and slowly, life began to find its balance again. James, humbled and scarred but determined, worked day after day, his calls to me no longer pleas for money but updates on his progress, questions about how to fix a leaky faucet, or how to balance a budget, conversations that felt less like burdens and more like bridges. One evening, he came to my house with an envelope in his hand, his steps hesitant but his eyes earnest. He sat at the same table where he had once called me a loser, slid the envelope across the wood, and said, "Dad, I know I can't erase what I said, but I want you to have this." Inside was a letter, handwritten, raw, every word carved out of guilt and longing, apologies for his cruelty, acknowledgments of my sacrifices, promises not to take me for granted again. I read it in silence, the ink smudged in places where his hand had lingered. And when I looked up, he sat there trembling, waiting for judgment. I reached across the table, gripped his hand, and said, "Respect is not given, James. It's built. But if you're ready to build, I'm here." His eyes glistened, his jaw trembled, and for the first time in years we sat not as enemies divided by Dylan's poison, but as father and son, scarred but slowly healing. And Dylan? His name faded from our lips like smoke disappearing in the wind. The investigations gutted his company, the fines mounted, his reputation shattered, and soon he was nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in back rooms and business circles. A man who once strutted with arrogance, but collapsed under the weight of his own lies. And as I sat on my porch one evening, the stars glittering above with a clarity that seemed almost divine, I realized this story had never been just about revenge. It had been about reclaiming dignity, about drawing a line between love and enabling, about teaching a son that a man's worth is not measured in cars or cash, but in character, sacrifice, and the courage to stand tall when the world calls you small. So if you've listened this far, remember this. Betrayal cuts deep, but dignity cuts deeper. Respect cannot be bought with money or stolen with arrogance. It must be earned, and it must be defended. And if you ever find yourself where I once stood, belittled, dismissed, betrayed, do not be afraid to reclaim what is yours, to draw the line, to teach the lesson that must be taught, because sometimes the greatest act of love is not giving, but stopping, so that those you love can finally learn to stand. This was my story, my storm, my truth, and it is yours now, too. And lastly, if this story struck a chord with you, if it reminded you of your own scars, your own strength, then I ask this. Subscribe to Relative Revenge, share this story so others can hear it, like this video to spread its message, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Because your voice matters, your story matters, and together we will make sure that no betrayal goes unanswered.